It is the early morning of August 28, 1943, and the North Atlantic is doing what it does best, punishing everything that dares to cross it. The waves roll in long, gray swells beneath a low ceiling of cloud, and the wind carries with it the particular cold that belongs only to this stretch of ocean, the kind that finds the gaps in a man's jacket no matter how tightly he pulls it closed. Somewhere below, invisible to the naked eye, the sea conceals its secrets. But Flight Lieutenant Lloyd Trigg is not flying on faith alone this morning. He has a contact. His Liberator bomber, a long-range patrol aircraft on loan to the Royal New Zealand Air Force's No. 200 Squadron, is already banking toward a smudge on the horizon, a shape that does not belong to the natural geometry of the ocean. It is a U-boat, running on the surface, as so many still did in these months, burning diesel to recharge its batteries after a night submerged. If you're new here and you love stories of courage that history almost forgot, consider subscribing. We cover these moments in full, the way they deserve to be told. The aircraft Trigg commands is a Consolidated B-24 Liberator, adapted for maritime patrol, fitted with depth charges and a lee light for night operations. It is not a glamorous machine. The men who flew these patrols described the work as hours of absolute monotony interrupted by seconds of absolute terror. Trigg's crew that morning numbered 7. They had been airborne for hours already, flying out of Bathurst in West Africa, over the South Atlantic, a different theater entirely from the Norwegian seas where men like Hornell would later fight, but governed by exactly the same merciless logic. Find the submarine. Kill the submarine. Come home if you can. The submarine below was U-468, commanded by Oberleutnant Zur C. Clemens Skamong. He was 26 years old. His boat was a Type 7C, the workhorse of the Kriegsmarine's U-boat fleet, 160 feet of welded steel crewed by 48 men. Type 7CS had, by this point in the war, become both the terror of Allied shipping and its most hunted target. In the summer of 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic had reached a brutal and decisive turning point that most of the men fighting it could not yet fully perceive. What they could perceive, in visceral and personal terms, was that the odds were shifting, and not in Germany's favor. To understand what happened on that August morning, and why it matters, you have to understand the world that produced both men in the air and underwater. You have to understand what the Atlantic had looked like just 1 year before, and what it had become. In the years 1940 and 1941, German U-boats had operated in what their crews called the Glückliche Zeit, the happy time. Wolfpacks coordinated by radio, directed by Admiral Karl Donitz from his headquarters first in Lorient and later in Berlin, had torn through Allied convoys with an efficiency that shocked even their own commanders. In October of 1940, in a single month, U-boats sank over 350,000 tons of Allied shipping. The mathematics were simple and catastrophic. Britain depended on imported food, fuel, and war material to survive. If the submarines could sink ships faster than the Allies could build them, the island nation would be strangled. Donitz had a theory, and it was not wrong. He calculated that if he could maintain a fleet of 300 operational U-boats in the Atlantic simultaneously, the tonnage losses inflicted on the Allies would be unsustainable. He never quite reached that number. The Kriegsmarine's production and crew training pipelines couldn't keep pace, but the boats he did have very nearly achieved what he envisioned. Between June 1940 and the end of 1941, U-boats sank over 1,000 Allied ships. The Atlantic felt, to the men who sailed it in convoys, less like a supply route and more like a graveyard waiting to be filled. But the men who flew anti-submarine patrol, the crews of Coastal Command, of the Royal Canadian Air Force, of the United States Navy Air Patrol, and of the smaller but no less determined Commonwealth squadrons, understood something about the submarine's fundamental vulnerability that the U-boat crews themselves sometimes forgot. A U-boat on the surface was fast and dangerous. A U-boat submerged was slow, nearly blind, and burning through battery power it could not easily replace. The airplane forced the submarine to choose between two kinds of danger, and no choice was good. Trigg had been in the fight long enough to understand these dynamics. He had flown patrols over waters where the evidence of the U-boat war was written on the surface in oil slicks and floating debris. He knew the statistics not as abstractions, but as the context for every patrol he flew. And on this particular morning, those statistics were finally beginning to turn. By the summer of 1943, The Allies had deployed a series of overlapping technical and tactical innovations that, taken together, were dismantling the U-boat threat faster than Donitz could adapt to them. Centimetric radar, operating on a wavelength the Germans had not yet equipped their submarines to detect, meant that aircraft and surface escorts could locate surface submarines in conditions that would previously have made them invisible, at night, in rain, in the gray half-light of dawn. The introduction of escort carriers provided air cover in the mid-Atlantic Gap, the stretch of ocean previously beyond the range of land-based patrol aircraft that submariners had called the Black Pit. Improved depth charge patterns, the Hedgehog anti-submarine mortar, and the growing use of the phytoacoustic homing torpedo all added layers to a system that was becoming, with each passing month, increasingly lethal to the men below the surface. May of 1943, just 3 months before Trigg's patrol, had seen such catastrophic U-boat losses that Donitz temporarily withdrew his wolfpacks from the North Atlantic entirely. 41 U-boats had been sunk in that single month. He wrote in his war diary that the losses had reached an unbearable level. The crews who continued to sail referred to their own submarines, with the particular dark humor of fighting men, as Eisern Sarge iron coffins. Skamong and the crew of U-468 knew they were sailing into a war that had changed. What they perhaps could not fully appreciate, in the way that only hindsight allows, was precisely how much it had changed, and what that change would cost them on this particular morning. Trigg's Liberator had taken off from RAF Bathurst, present-day Banjul, in the Gambia, in the pre-dawn hours. The base at Bathurst was part of a growing network of Allied anti-submarine patrol stations along the West African coast, positioned to cover the Central and South Atlantic, the routes along which U-boats increasingly operated as pressure in the North Atlantic intensified. No. 200 Squadron had been transferred to Coastal Command duty in the spring of 1943, re-equipped with Liberators and given the unglamorous but essential task of patrolling thousands of square miles of open ocean in search of submarines that usually weren't there. The Liberator was a demanding aircraft. With a wingspan of over 110 feet and 4 Pratt & Whitney twin Wasp engines, it could carry a heavy weapon load over enormous distances. On very long-range patrol configurations, it could stay airborne for close to 16 hours. But it was not forgiving of mechanical trouble, and in the South Atlantic, mechanical trouble was always a possibility. The crews who flew these patrols accepted, as a condition of the work, that a serious failure far from any coast meant the sea, and the sea meant death. On this particular sortie, there was an additional complication. Trigg's aircraft had already expended its depth charges on an earlier contact. Accounts differ on the specifics, and when U-468 was sighted on the surface, the Liberator was carrying only anti-submarine bombs, a different and in some respects less ideal weapon for the attack profile Trigg was about to attempt. This detail matters. It is the kind of detail that separates a historical account from a mere story, because it forces you to reckon with the actual texture of the decision that Trigg was about to make. He had a contact. He had a weapons load that was workable but not optimal. He had a crew, and he had a submarine below him that, if he let it dive, would vanish and potentially go on to kill dozens of merchant sailors before anyone found it again. He turned toward the target. Below, lookouts on U-468 would have had only seconds of warning. A Liberator at patrol altitude, throttling up and banking into an attack run, descends rapidly. The U-boat's flak guns, a 20mm cannon, and, on later variants, a heavier anti-aircraft battery added in response to exactly this kind of threat, would be manned and turning. The Battle of the Atlantic in the summer of 1943 had produced, on the German side, a tactical doctrine that reflected the new reality. When caught on the surface by an aircraft, some commanders chose to fight back rather than dive, on the theory that a submarine crash diving under accurate air attack was nearly as vulnerable as one that stayed up and returned fire. This was not a doctrine born of confidence. It was a doctrine born of desperation, and it cost both sides dearly. What happened next unfolded in the space of seconds, but its consequences would ripple outward for months, cross the desks of senior officers on both sides of the war, and eventually reach the deliberations of the committee that awards the highest military decorations in the British Commonwealth. Trigg pressed his attack. The Liberator came in low and fast, taking hits as it descended, the flak from U-468 finding the aircraft as surely as Trigg was finding the submarine. The bomb release was made at extremely low altitude, the kind of altitude that left almost no margin. The weapons landed close enough, but the Liberator was burning. Now here is where this story departs from the kind of clean heroism that gets simplified in the retelling and enters the territory of something more complicated and more true. Because what happened in the minutes after Trigg's attack is known to us not from any Allied account, not from the after-action report filed by Trigg's squadron. There was none because no one from Trigg's crew survived to file one, but from the testimony of the men he had just tried to kill. U-468 was sinking. The attack had been lethal. But before she went down, her surviving crew had time to witness what happened to the aircraft that had killed their boat. Trigg's burning Liberator hit the water. It did not survive the impact. Of the 8 men aboard, none were recovered. 7 survivors of U-468 were pulled from the sea by HMS Clarkia, a Flower-class corvette that arrived on the scene shortly afterward. And it was these men, Skamong's surviving crew, who provided the testimony on which Lloyd Trigg's Victoria Cross citation would ultimately rest. This is, as far as can be determined, the only instance in the entire Second World War in which a Victoria Cross was awarded on the basis of evidence provided solely by the enemy. Let that sit for a moment because it is not a detail that resolves cleanly into any simple narrative. There is something in this story that resists the usual framing of wartime heroism. The men who vouched for Trigg's courage were the same men whose boat he had destroyed, whose crewmates he had killed, who were themselves prisoners of war when they gave their statements. They had no reason to exaggerate his bravery, quite the opposite, one might think. And yet, their account was consistent, and it described what they had witnessed with a precision and an absence of embellishment that the officers who reviewed it found credible. They said Trigg had pressed his attack knowing the aircraft was already fatally damaged. They said he had come in at an altitude that made his own survival impossible even if the weapons worked perfectly. They said they had watched the aircraft hit the water and had seen no survivors emerge. The Royal New Zealand Air Force received the posthumous award on Trigg's behalf. He was 32 years old. He had a wife and he had, in the way that men in that war so often did, continued to fly his patrols without fanfare or apparent hesitation, in conditions that offered no guarantee and little comfort. You are watching this story because it is not well known. Most people who know about the Victoria Cross do not know his name. That is, in itself, part of what this channel exists to address, the gap between what was done and what is remembered. But Trigg's story, remarkable as it is, sits within a larger context that August of 1943 was actively writing. Because U-468 was not the only U-boat lost in these waters in these weeks. And the pattern of losses, taken together, tells a story about the arc of the entire campaign that no single engagement can capture alone. In the summer of 1943, the South Atlantic had become what the approaches to Britain had been the year before. A hunting ground, but now the hunters were increasingly in the air. Coastal Command, working alongside the United States Army Air Force's Anti-Submarine Command and the Navy Patrol Squadrons, had developed a coverage pattern that was beginning to close the remaining gaps. Aircraft based in West Africa covered the eastern South Atlantic. Aircraft based in Brazil, operating under agreements that brought that country into the Allied orbit, covered the western approaches. Escort carriers filled the spaces between. The U-boats that continued to operate in these waters were not the wolfpacks of 1941, coordinated and confident. They were individual patrols, often operating under radio silence to avoid detection by Allied direction-finding equipment, hunting alone in waters that were becoming steadily more dangerous. The supply situation for U-boats in the South Atlantic was also deteriorating. Submarine tankers, the so-called milchq or milk cows, had been specifically targeted by Allied intelligence. The Enigma decrypts flowing out of Bletchley Park had given the Allies detailed knowledge of rendezvous positions, and by mid-1943 most of the milk cow submarines had been sunk. U-boats that ran low on fuel or torpedoes in the South Atlantic had very few options for resupply. This operational context shaped everything about what Skamong and his crew were doing when Trigg found them. They were not the spearhead of an offensive. They were a single boat, operating at the end of a very long and increasingly fragile logistical chain, in waters that had recently become far more dangerous than their orders had accounted for. And they were found, as U-boats so often were by this point in the war, by an aircraft they hadn't seen coming until it was too late to do anything but fight. The wreckage of U-468 and the burning scar Trigg's Liberator left on the surface of the South Atlantic were, in the cold accounting of the campaign, 2 entries in a ledger that was growing heavier on the Allied side with every passing week. But ledgers don't capture what it felt like to be inside those numbers. To understand that, you have to go below the surface, not metaphorically but literally. You have to understand what life aboard a U-boat in the late summer of 1943 actually was, what it smelled like, what it sounded like, and what it demanded of the men who lived it. A Type 7C U-boat was, by any reasonable measure, an extraordinary feat of engineering in an extraordinarily confined space. 167 feet from bow to stern, with a pressure hull roughly 14 feet in diameter at its widest point, it housed a crew of between 44 and 52 men depending on the patrol configuration. There were no bunks enough for every man. The practice called hot bunking meant that a bunk vacated by a man going on watch was immediately occupied by a man coming off one. Personal space was measured in inches. Freshwater was rationed so strictly that showering was a luxury unavailable for most of a patrol's duration. The air inside a submerged boat was recycled through chemical scrubbers that removed carbon dioxide, but couldn't remove the accumulated smell of diesel fuel, unwashed bodies, mold growing on the bread, and the particular mechanical odor of machinery run continuously in a sealed environment. And yet the men who crewed these boats, at least in the earlier years of the war, had volunteered for submarine service. The Kriegsmarine had its pick of candidates. The pay was higher, the camaraderie was intense, and there was, in 1940 and 41, a genuine sense that submariners were the elite of the German naval war, the men who were actually winning. The aces of the U-boat arm were household names in Germany. Gunther Prien, who had penetrated the British naval anchorage at Scapa Flow and sunk the battleship Royal Oak. Otto Kretschmer, who had sunk over 250,000 tons of Allied shipping before his capture. Joachim Schepke, Eric Topp. Their faces appeared on newsreel footage and magazine covers. They were decorated in ceremonies attended by Dönitz himself, sometimes by Hitler. By the summer of 1943, Prien was dead. Kretschmer was a prisoner of war. Schepke was dead. The generation of commanders who had made the happy time possible had been killed, captured, or had survived long enough to be assigned to training commands, which was itself a kind of testimony to how the mathematics of survival had changed. The men who replaced them were younger, less experienced, and sailing into a war that the propaganda apparatus in Berlin had not yet fully acknowledged had turned. German newsreels in the summer of 1943 still spoke of the U-boat arm in the present tense of heroes. The reality experienced by the men actually at sea was something altogether different. For the crews of Allied anti-submarine patrol, the summer of 1943 brought its own particular mixture of exhaustion, vigilance, and an emerging but carefully unspoken sense that the tide was shifting. The patrols were long and physically demanding. The Liberator's crew sat for hours in a fuselage that was cold at altitude, loud with engine noise, and vibrating constantly. Navigation over open ocean without landmarks required continuous attention. The radar operator swept his screen methodically, knowing that the contact he was looking for might appear and disappear in seconds. The lookouts scanned the surface below with binoculars, their eyes aching from the glare off the water. Most patrols found nothing. That was the statistical reality of anti-submarine patrol work. The ocean is vast, and a submarine, even one running on the surface, presents a very small profile against the gray immensity of open water. A crew could fly for 12 hours, cover thousands of square miles, and return to base with nothing to report but fuel consumption and weather observations. Then they would sleep, and the next day they would do it again. The culture of the squadrons that flew these patrols was shaped by this rhythm. There was no front line in the conventional sense, no position that could be pointed to on a map and called progress. There was only the patrol and the occasional contact and the outcome of that contact, which might be a sinking or might be nothing at all. The men who flew these missions for months at a time developed a particular kind of professional detachment. Not indifference, but a learned capacity to conduct themselves with precision and discipline regardless of what the emotional register of the moment was demanding. Trigg embodied this. His record before August 28th shows the pattern of a man who did the work without noise. His decoration recommendation, written in the aftermath of the action over U-468, noted his previous service without specific drama. He had flown his patrols. He had done what was required. When the moment came that required something beyond what was required, he did that too. Now consider what the German survivors actually witnessed. because their testimony is the beating heart of this story and it deserves to be examined carefully. When HMS Clarkia recovered the 7 survivors of U-468, Skamong was among the dead. The men were in poor condition. They had been in the water. They were cold, exhausted, and processing the shock of having watched their boat and most of their crewmates die. They were prisoners with all the uncertainty that implied. And yet, when they were interviewed about the circumstances of the sinking, their accounts were not evasive or minimal. They described the attack in detail. They described the Liberator coming in low and on fire, pressing its run despite the damage already taken. They described the weapons landing close enough to doom their boat. And they described watching the burning aircraft hit the water and not watching anyone get out. The officer who conducted the initial interrogation noted their apparent sincerity. These were not men offering a generous account of their enemy out of sentiment. Sentiment was not a currency that 1943 had left much of on either side. They were describing what they had seen, with the specificity that comes from having been very close to a very violent event and having survived it. The phrase used in the subsequent recommendation, translated through the layers of official language, was that Trigg had pressed his attack with full knowledge that his aircraft was doomed, at an altitude that offered him no chance of survival, in order to place his weapons accurately enough to destroy the submarine. The recommendation noted that this judgment, that he had known, and had chosen anyway, rested entirely on the enemy's testimony. It noted this not as a qualification or a caveat, but as a fact to be weighed. The committee weighed it and found it sufficient. The Victoria Cross was gazetted on the 2nd of November, 1943. The citation read, in the formal and compressed language of such documents, that Trigg had shown valor of the highest order, that he had made the attack with full awareness of his own position, and that the evidence for this came from the men he had attacked. It did not try to resolve the strangeness of that last fact. It simply stated it. There is a version of this story that would be satisfied with the decoration and move on. Heroism confirmed, award given, chapter closed. But that version leaves out the things that are hardest to say and perhaps most worth saying. Lloyd Trigg had a wife named Nora. He had joined the Royal New Zealand Air Force in 1941 and had come to West Africa by the particular logic of a war that sent men to places they had never expected to be, to fight in ways they had never imagined, against enemies they had never met. New Zealand, a country of roughly 1.5 million people at the time, would lose over 11,000 dead in the Second World War. The proportion of its population that served, and the proportion of those who did not return, was among the highest of any Allied nation. The men of No. 200 Squadron were a long way from home in every sense that phrase can carry. The South Atlantic, from the perspective of most people's mental map of the Second World War, barely registers. The great set pieces of the conflict, Stalingrad, Normandy, the Pacific Island campaigns, the air battles over Britain, draw the attention and hold it. The anti-submarine war over open ocean has no geography that sticks in the memory, no landmarks, no before and after photographs. What it has is the ledger, the number of ships that went down, the number of men who drowned or burned in the water, the number of aircraft that flew out and did not come back, the number of submarines that slipped beneath the surface for the last time. In this ledger, Trigg's entry is one among many. And that is precisely the point. The campaign that Trigg was part of was won, ultimately, not by any single act of heroism, however genuine, but by the cumulative effect of thousands of patrols, thousands of contacts, thousands of decisions made by men in cold cockpits over gray water. The ones we remember are the ones where something exceptional occurred, a particularly striking act of courage, a particularly improbable survival, a particular irony that the record preserved. Most of them are not remembered at all. HMS Clarkia delivered her prisoners to port and filed her report. The 7 survivors of U-468 were processed through the Allied prisoner of war system and spent the remainder of the conflict in captivity. Their testimony was extracted from the interrogation record, forwarded through the appropriate channels, and eventually reached the desk of the officer responsible for preparing Trigg's posthumous recommendation. Somewhere in that process, someone made the decision that the enemy's word was enough, that what these men had seen and described, stripped of every other context, constituted reliable evidence of extraordinary valor. It is worth pausing on that decision because it is not obvious. It would have been entirely possible, perhaps even natural, to regard the testimony of prisoners of war with suspicion, to find reasons to question their account, to conclude that without Allied witnesses the evidence was insufficient. Instead, the officers who reviewed the file concluded the opposite. They found the specificity and consistency of the survivors' accounts to be more credible, not less, precisely because the men had no evident reason to embellish the bravery of the man who had killed their boat and their crewmates. If anything, the logic ran they would be inclined to minimize it. The fact that they did not minimize it, that they described what they had seen with apparent care and without apparent agenda, gave their testimony a weight that an Allied account might, paradoxically, have lacked. This is the moment in the story where the war's usual categories begin to loosen. Not to dissolve, this was still a war, and Trigg had still been trying to kill Skamong's crew, and Skamong's crew had still been trying to kill him. The violence was real and the stakes were real and nobody involved was confused about which side they were on. But in the space of those survivors' testimony, something happened that the machinery of armed conflict does not usually make room for. One set of combatants bore honest witness to the courage of another. The Victoria Cross that Nora Trigg received on behalf of her husband is held today in a collection in New Zealand. Lloyd Trigg is commemorated on the Air Force's Memorial at Runnymede, in Surrey, England, where the names of over 20,000 airmen who died in the Second World War and have no known grave are inscribed on the panels of a memorial that overlooks the Thames. His name is there because the sea that took him kept him. There is no grave to visit, no marker that can be stood beside. There is the memorial and there is the record, and there is the citation that rests uniquely on the word of his enemies. No. 200 Squadron continued its patrols out of Bathurst through the remainder of 1943 and into 1944. The South Atlantic gradually became what all the contested stretches of ocean became as the anti-submarine campaign reached its conclusion. Not safe, exactly, but no longer the hunting ground it had been. The U-boats that continued to operate there did so with diminishing effect and at increasing cost. Donitz, who had written in his diary in May 1943 that the losses were unbearable, never found a solution to the problem that Trigg and the other Coastal Command crews represented. The centimetric radar could not be defeated by any countermeasure the Germans deployed in time to matter. The escort carriers could not be countered by tactical adjustments to wolfpack doctrine. The acoustic torpedo, the Fido, against which the only defense was to stay deep and stay slow, changed the calculus of survival for every U-boat commander who knew about it, and knowing about it did not help because the alternative to diving was staying on the surface and being strafed. There were no good options. There was only the choice between different kinds of bad ones. By May of 1945, when the German Naval Command transmitted the ceasefire order to all U-boats at sea, 784 U-boats had been lost in the war. Approximately 28,000 German submariners had died, out of roughly 40,000 who served. The attrition rate was, by any measure, catastrophic. It was higher than that of any other branch of any armed force on either side of the conflict. The men who had volunteered for submarine service in 1940 and 1941, lured by the prestige and the pay and the sense of being on the winning side, had sailed into a war that changed under them without adequate warning. The propaganda that had made the U-boat aces into celebrities had not prepared their successors for what it actually meant to sail a patrol in the South Atlantic in the summer of 1943, or for what was waiting in the sky. What Trigg's story asks us to hold, finally, is not a simple tribute to courage, though the courage was real and was recognized by the most demanding possible witnesses. What it asks us to hold is something about the texture of the war at that particular moment. The strange and specific convergence of technology, strategy, individual decision, and human witness that produced this one event out of the millions that the war contained. The centimetric radar found U-468. The patrol pattern brought Trigg's Liberator to that patch of ocean at that hour. The flak from Skamong's crew set the aircraft on fire. Trigg made his decision in the seconds available to him, with the information available to him, and pressed his attack. The depth charges fell where they needed to fall. The submarine sank, and the aircraft sank, and 7 men survived to tell what they had seen. That chain of cause and effect is, in one sense, utterly mechanical physics, trajectory, timing. In another sense, it is about something that physics cannot measure. The will of a man in a burning aircraft to complete what he had come to do, and the honesty of his enemies in saying so. The war in the South Atlantic was won in the aggregate, in the statistics, in the industrial output of American shipyards and British factories and the code-breaking rooms at Bletchley Park. It was won in decisions made by admirals and air marshals in offices far from the open ocean. But it was also won, in the most immediate and irreducible sense, by men like Trigg, flying long patrols over empty water, pressing their attacks when they found their targets and not coming home. Their names are on memorials. Some of them, like Trigg, are on memorials because the sea kept them and gave them nothing back but the word of the men they had fought. That word, in his case, was enough. If the story found you and stayed with you, the way the best of these stories do, share it with someone who deserves to know it. And if you want to keep finding the corners of the Second World War that the textbooks missed, stay with us. There are more of them than you might think, and every one of them was earned.